In today's lesson, we will be getting started and integrating STK with Python. I wanted to provide some more background and context for what we're going to do today. Right now, we're going to be utilizing the STK integration module. So this is a special license that you would have received. This will enhance any of the integration capabilities that you have with your software, allows you to automate any task, any builds and analysis, and can allow you to bring in external data, visualize it in STK, and even export that information out. So there's a lot of benefits with integrating STK with other tools. And then if you are automating different behaviors, you can develop custom applications and utilize the STK, the AGI object model collection for your other tools. In this case, we're going to be focusing in on Python. So once again, you can extend any of the capabilities, and you're utilizing the calculations and the analysis that STK does to further whatever analysis you were already working on. All right, I'm going to keep going. And then, yes, like I said, you can automate, extend, and visualize your analysis, which automating it lets you essentially be able to send a script file, which with a click of a button will build up your assets, your objects, conduct your analysis, and spit out your results. You can extend any of the capabilities built into STK or anything else you're working on, and then also being able to visualize your analysis and your data in STK and knowing that your data is modeled as accurately and as best as can is a great capability. In today's lesson, we will be primarily, and then there's just to finally go over this a little bit more. There's different levels for how you can integrate things. So you can bring in files, import them and export them, which you can do through the GUI. Connect is a built-in capability with STK that allows you to create custom scripts and regenerate any action you would do in the GUI. The object model allows you to do more programming, more object-oriented programming, and work more so with the data providers, and then you can always create your own custom plugins. All right, for this particular training class, we are going to be using Python. So before the training class itself, please make sure you have Python installed on your computer. There's 3 available options that you can go through and use. I am specifically using the Anaconda option with Spider, but you can use either one of these. So either the Python web install, where you can pip install the comp types library, or either the third option, which is WinPython, and you can use either the Spider or Jupyter notebooks. A little bit about each option. There's pros and cons to each one. If you do the Python web install, you'll have to pip install the comp types library yourself. However, then you can use any text editor or IDE that you want. Using this method, you will not have IntelliSense, which is something you might have seen if you're familiar with MATLAB or any other scripting, where you hit that like tab button and then it auto completes and lets you fill in different options. I am using the second option, so I'm using Anaconda with the Spider. Spider and Jupyter come installed with these distributions and can be launched individually or from Anaconda. Perks of this is that comp types is going to be installed, and so I'll have that IntelliSense. And then finally, WinPython, which the comp types will also be installed. You can use the Spider or Jupyter notebooks. And once again, those will come installed and can be launched on their own. We also have a ton of great resources that you can utilize. So we have an FAQ page on getting started with STK-COM integration using Python. That directly links to our GitHub page. And then we can also always take a look at the Python code snippets if we have some specific questions. So I'm going to open up each one of these to show you the resources on the web so you guys can get an eye on it. You can access this page from our FAQ page, so it'll link to it there. The question is, how do I use Python to drive STK? And then it sort of walks you through it and provides really good background. And then it links to the GitHub page. which also was developed by somebody at AGI and also has a ton of information about using Python and STK together. And then finally, if you want to take a look at the Python code snippets, and then I'll also pull up the Python lesson so we can see that. It'll be at help.agi.com, the STK programming interface help. If I want to look at the Python code snippets, I'll select this first option that says tutorials, code samples, code snippets, and online resources. And towards the bottom, I can actually just utilize the Python code snippets, which are great because they provide me examples of the code for a variety of applications. And of course, these are not the only things you can do, but we try to provide as much information as we can to help you get started. All right, so once again, we're in the tutorials, code samples, code snippets, and online resources, and I just opened up the Python code snippets. Okay. The lesson that we are going to be doing today is underneath, is on our STK training website. So if I go to STK or help.agi.com and open up the STK help, this particular lesson is something that's taught in our L2 topics. So it's underneath our training materials. So complete list of self-paced training courses. And we are actually covering something underneath our level 2 topics, which is integrating STK with Python. So if you wanted to have this opened up on your machine, it could be beneficial to have the script itself open up so that you can see the code itself. And then if you wanted to, you could definitely copy and paste it here. But for the most part, the actual script we're going to be running is already complete and filled out. So this help page is actually using the 11.4 install, so the file locations might be a little bit different. But I'm going to have everybody open up or bring over the script file so that we can get started on that. If you take a look at this lesson, it'll tell you to browse to your install directory, data, resources, STK training, and scripts. Now this is specifically if you have STK 11.4 installed. Otherwise, if you're using an earlier version of STK, so I'll have that up on my computer here, you can navigate to your STK install folder, help, STK training, and then scripts. So I'll leave this up here for just a little bit longer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this script and just put it on my desktop. That way if I want to make changes to it or edit it, I can certainly do so. But otherwise, if you wanted to actually just base it off of the lesson on the web, you could actually essentially run the same thing by copying all the script lines. All right, but this file is located in this file directory, and I'll leave this up here, but I will be copying and pasting this to my desktop so I can get started. All right, so copying that, and then just pasting it to my desktop. All right, so my Python script here. And a little bit more background, this Python script is pre-written so if you decided to run just the script, it would actually open up and analyze the STK scenario. But I'm going to have us walk through it step by step. So like I said, I'm running everything on Spider. So I'm going to open up that tool, and then we can get started. So if you haven't installed your license or Python, you can do that in the next couple of minutes, and we can get started. This lesson itself was built in Python 3.5, but currently I'm running 3.6, and that's completely fine. So if you're using an older version of Python or a more recent version, there really shouldn't be any issue with what you're going to run. So I'll give you guys another moment or so to get everything set up, and then we'll get started. All right. So like I said before, this lesson is already pre-written with all the setup and all the actions. So if you wanted to completely just like run the script, you could. That would build your scenario, conduct your analysis. Another great thing about integrating STK with other tools is once you have your script file, if you decided to share that with one of your coworkers, you can have them easily build the analysis, conduct it with a click of a button. So integration and having a script file makes sharing a analysis and sharing a mission much easier as well. All right, so now that I have Python up and running, I'm going to use this Python script file here to go through and run my analysis. Rather than running all of it just from the beginning, I'm going to walk us through it line by line and step by step to at least provide more context for what we're doing and how we're setting things up. So if you're building your script from scratch, you can always reference our help page. So once again, this is on our level 2 topics, integrating STK with Python. You can always copy the scripts from here. But we're going to do the first couple steps, which is to set up our Python workspace. Right. So from Win32 API, I'm going to import my Git system metrics. I'm going to import the com types and then import create object. So I'm just going to copy these first 3 lines and actually just paste them into my console and hit enter twice to just run those lines. This from com types line here will actually give you that IntelliSense so that when we're going through and writing our script, if we hit that tab option, it will autocomplete and tell you what else we can do with it. So this will essentially connect Python to STK. And so the next couple things we need to do is actually create our scenario and create an instance of STK to run through and do our analysis. So in these next couple lines, I'm going to do the UI application. So that's going to be my variable. And I'm going to create a scenario object. And then I'm going to set the UI application and so the visibility and the user controls. I'm going to copy and paste that into here. What we are doing in this particular analysis is creating a STK scenario from scratch. So we'll actually be building it up. So you'll see something in your toolbar open up, which is going to be your new STK scenario. We haven't set the environment just yet, and we'll do that in the next couple steps. So our approach in this analysis is going to be to build a scenario. However, if you have a running instance of STK, you can also connect to that instance. All right. And the next line we're going to use is going to be this root is equal to UI application personality 2. So I can write this in there too, rather than copying it. So root is equal to UI application. So now that I have that IntelliSense, I can use that tab option to fill in what I want it to do. So I want to set it to personality 2. So personality 2 will, so if you actually take a note of the lesson, it will actually create the concept library and creates folders that contain the STK utilities and the STK objects. So like for object model, it's primarily used for object model to grab the relevant interfaces. Yeah, so personality 2 will grab the relevant interfaces. Personality 1, in case you're curious, will be primarily for your like HTML pages, your VB script, and your JavaScript, things that you might see in the GUI and all those buttons. But to actually grab the object itself, we'll be using personality 2. All right, I'm going to hit run, so enter to run that. Now this next step here, and there's a note over here to provide more background, which I recommend you read it over and it can provide more information. But whenever you are using Python for the first time, you want to run these two lines after you run personality 2. However, once these have been run on your computer, you can actually move them to the top up here. And I'd actually moved them down below. But yeah, you can move these to the top so that the next couple times they run when you first go through and import everything. But when you first start using Python and STK on a machine, you want to run these after personality 2. So I'm going to bring in and import these last two statements. So this is just establishing our Python environment and making sure that we are connected to the proper tools and utilities in STK. All right. Moving on to the second task, now we can actually get started and work on our analysis. So the next task here is to create a new scenario. These next couple actions are going to be really similar to when you open STK through the GUI and you see that panel that tells you to name the scenario and set the time. So we're using our root command, creating a new scenario, calling it Python starter. So I'll do that. I'll copy these two lines and run them next. And then we want to set the analytical time period. We'll base it off of today and go 24 hours into the future. And if you want to run semicolons after it, oops, to express any output, you can do that too. So enter twice to run those next two lines. And then if you take a look at your scenario, you can see the environment that it builds up and it sets. So right now this is called Python starter, exactly what I named it. And it's going to go forward in time 24 hours. Right. Finally, we're going to just reset this and set this to the beginning of our scenario start time. So root rewind. I'm just taking a look at wherever my browser for the timeline view has been. So at this point here, you can go back and forth if you want to make changes in your SDK interface, or if you just want to stick to the code, which is what we'll be doing, you can just automate and write in your scripts in your lines of code. All right. The next couple things we're going to do is we're going to bring in objects. So like any mission you work on, you'll be bringing in your assets and the objects that will be used in your mission. In this case, we're going to add a target object to the scenario. So I'm looking at task 3. We're going to adjust its positioning, and then we're going to bring in a satellite. I just want to focus in very briefly on this root.execute command for the satellite. This is actually referencing a connect command. So if you're familiar with using connect in STK, you'll know that any connect command will mimic any action in the GUI. In this connect command, we'll specifically set the entire state of the satellite's orbit in a single line. So I can set, and I know this because I'm familiar with the terminology, but you can always take a look at the help. But the last few numbers here are actually setting the orbital parameters. So semi-major axis, and this one here is going to be the inclination. So it's going to be some highly inclined orbit. But more information on this is in our Connect help documentation. Just to show you, if you're still on the help page, there's something called Integrating with STK. And I recommend taking a look at the Connect command library. You can do like the alphabetical listing. And then underneath S, there is a set state, and it's in alphabetical order. Yeah, so there's different set state commands, and then you can see that the last couple items in the list are going to be your semi-major axis, eccentricity, and so on. So you can do either approach. So you can either manually set your code, to set your satellite's orbital parameters one at a time, or just use a connect command, which does it all at once. And the nice thing about connect is that it's easy to read through, and there's a lot of help and resources available for it. So in this case, it's just going to set the orbit of the satellite. All right, let's bring this in line by line. Right. So first going to bring in my target object, and I'm going to adjust its position. Next, I'm going to insert in my satellite. And also going to run that root.execute command, which will set the state of my satellite in orbit. And if you wanted to check, you can always take a look at your scenario to make sure your objects are there. So I have my satellite in orbit. It is some LEOsat in a highly inclined orbit. Now these next couple lines, yeah, I just copied them and pasted them in to run them one at a time. So I'll give you guys a moment to do that, and then we'll focus in on computing access in the next couple steps. I would say that establishing, so when you're working with STK and any other integration tools, the things that are important is, like to begin with, it's making sure you haven't established a connection between your interface and STK, in this case Python and STK, which is what we did in the beginning. And the next important thing to think about is pulling data in and out of STK. So it's nice to be able to load your data into STK and be able to visualize it, and it's just as important to be able to pull out the results of your analysis. We'll be focusing on that a little bit next, and I'll talk you through a bit of it. So now that we have two objects in our scenario, so it's going to be a target on the ground and some satellite, we're going to compute access. And access is the most fundamental type of calculation you can do in STK. It establishes the relationship between two objects. The code itself is written over here, but I just want to show you guys where it's located in the help, because other than having like a script file right in front of you, most likely you'll be going through the documentation in the help to try to figure out the next couple steps for the analysis. So let's go back to the web browser. I'll re-navigate us to the programming help documentation, and then we'll take a look at the at some of the lines of code and how we can use them. So this is a bit of a spoiler, so it's already here, but just to show you where the resources live on the web. Yeah, I'll re-navigate to this, so it's going to be help.agi.com. So up at the top, whatever your browser is, you can open up help.agi.com. Then the STK programming interface help. We can take a look at the tutorials, code samples, code snippets, and online resources. And then if you scroll down the page, there's the Python code snippets. So if I am interested in computing access, I would take a look at the access section. And then there's a couple options. So from here, I can take a look at what I need to do in my setup to set some of these constraints, if I have like multiple access constraints, or if I want to configure things in other ways. To compute access between two STK objects, and I can choose which option I want to use, so the IAG STK object interface or the object path. I can select that option, and it will navigate and show me exactly what that what those lines should look like. Up at the top, it tells me what objects I already need in my STK scenario, so I can't just copy and paste this and throw this into a code. I actually need my objects in there in the first place. So this particular setup is computing access between a satellite and a facility object. And so to get access by an object, I create a variable, and it's going to be from my satellite, and I'm getting access to, in this case, a facility. In our case, if you take a look back at our code, you'll notice that we created an object called target. So instead of computing access between a facility or a satellite and a facility, it'll be between a satellite and a target. Right. And if you take a look at this line here, you can also imagine that if you are computing access between the GUI, this line here is essentially that page on the access window where you highlight the objects you want to compute access to. And then finally, to actually compute the access, you run the access period compute access command, and that's like the compute access button. All right, so we'll be using these lines here in our code. So I'm computing access. So I'll create a variable called access, and it's going to be from my satellite object. And this is, once again, where that IntelliSense is very useful. So autocomplete my satellite. And then from when I put in the period and hit tab, I can choose what I want to do. In this case, I want to get access to an object. And so I'll hit enter to set that command. And the object I have in my scenario is called a target. All right, now to compute access for this variable I just created, I'm going to write an access period and then compute the access. All right, so computing access over here. Just to check, if you take a look at your scenario, once you've computed access, you should see access lines in your 2D graphics window. That's something that visually happens when you compute access in any STK scenario. The parts of your, in this case, it's going to be orbit tracks that have that line of sight to your other object will be highlighted. And visually, this is great to see. But more importantly, we want to focus in on being able to pull our data out. So we'll talk about that step in just a little bit. But I want to make sure that everybody else who's working on this has at least computed access between their two objects. And then we'll talk about data providers in just a moment. So in case you're wondering, we're task 4. And we're going to talk more so about data providers in STK. So when we reference data providers, or when we're talking about data providers, we're actually talking about everything that STK can calculate about any given object, or in this case, like an access calculation. If you want to know what the available data providers are, you can always take a look at the help. If you have STK open, those data providers are going to be those categories you see when you create your own custom reports and graphs. So I'm not going to change anything, I'm not going to create anything, but I just want to show that this is something else you can do. So I'm just showing this, we're not going to make any changes in our STK scenarios. So for example, if I wanted to create a, if I wanted to pull out data about my, my satellite, the data providers are these categories here. Once again, they're everything that is calculated when you do anything in STK, and then you can choose how to pull your data out and what components you're specifically interested in. Some of these are just grouped by, you have your single level and then the items underneath it. Other ones are grouped a little bit differently, and I'll find a good example of it. Yeah. Some of them have subgroups. Might be due to like their reference frame or just the subgroup types. And so it's really important that when you are pulling data out of STK, you know what parameters you're interested in and what information you want to generate out of your scenario. So it's always good to know things by name and how they are categorized in STK. Right. But the data providers are, of course, everything that is calculated under the hood, essentially anything you can calculate in STK, and you can use any integration technique to pull that data out. All right, so I'm going to go back to my script, and I'm just going to talk about the lines that we have. All right, I want to focus in on this area here. So if you're taking a look at the lesson, it's It's the task about generating and pulling data out from your computed access. All right. So insert STK objects, compute access, so on. All right, and pulling data out. So when you generate any data in STK, so I'm creating a variable called access DP for data providers, and the type of data I'm going to be pulling out is going to be from my access data section. And when you pull out, when you pull information from the data providers, it pulls just the generic format. So you need to choose how you want to cast your data. So you need to cast the specific data provider. In this case, we'll be using the query interface, and we'll be pulling our data between a interval. So if you just take a look at the next line really quickly, the interval that we're selecting is between our scenario start time and our scenario stop time. And that's just this method that we are doing. So this is casting, so this option here is casting the data between two moments in time, which we have specified in the next line. Let's see. So this line here will actually set the time. Okay. And let's do parts of this step by step so that you guys can actually see some of the other options when we hit that tab complete. But overall, this is the format we're going to use. But I just want to walk us through some of the other setup stuff. So I'm going to create something called access data providers. It will be from my access object. And I am interested in the data. So data providers. And specifically interested in my access data. All right. So access data providers 2. Query interface. So can choose how I decide to pull out my data. The one I will be doing is the IAG data PVR interval. And this list is actually surprisingly long. So access advanced, constraint angle, background, conditions, and so on. Data, and then I want PVR, not element, but interval. All right. So there's a ton of ways you can format your data and cast your data, and this is the option that we're going to be using. If you have more questions about this, we have a ton of documentation about it on the web and how everything should be formatted. All right. So now we're going to set whatever our time is. So creating something called results and focusing them between two time periods, which are going to be my scenario start time and then my scenario stop time. So then the next couple lines are actually pulling out that data. So if I want to see all the values for my, between the period that I've specified and those data sets, I can choose and pull out my times with this next line. So I'll create a variable that just has my access start times. Data sets. And then I'm going to get my data set by name. And my data set is called start time. And I know this because if I took a look at my data providers list, I would see that in my data providers. All right. So I created that. Now I'm going to create another one that is just my access stop times. And hitting that tab complete saves me the trouble of typing in everything. So setting it up to measure and pull out my stop time. All right. And now to finally display my data, I can print out my information. So printing out my access start time, and I'm just hitting tab to print out my access stop times. And once I have this information out there, of course, this is a very simple data set of meaning it's just pulling out the start and stop times, but you can do the same type of extraction to pull out data for anything else that you can calculate or compute in STK. And now that I have it in Python, if I wanted to go further in the analysis, I at least have another tool that can allow me to do that. All right. Next, we're going to go through the task 5, which is retrieving data from our satellite. The way that this is primarily different from that first data set is going to be how we reference the data and how we pull it out. So this next data set is underneath the LLA state. So we're going to be pulling out the altitude values later on. But this data set, so if I go back and open up my my properties, just take a look. The LLA state, I'm going to scroll through. The LLA state has various, in this case it has a subgroup. Some of these other options have multiple reference frames or different groups underneath it. So in this case, I'm going to have to, let's see. So I'm going to have to just identify which group and subgroup I am referring to when I pull out my data. And then I will, of course, pull it out by name here. So in this case, I'm going to pull out data about my satellite. So my satellite, creating a variable that's satellite DP to my satellite object, data providers. And the information I'm interested in this situation is my LLA state. Once again, you can choose any sort of data provider categories to pull out your data. All right, the next line here is how we identify which subgroup it is. So this one will pull data from one of those subgroups, and that group is going to be the fixed item. So I'll do this the next couple lines. So satellite DP2. So it's a satellite data providers 2, so DP2 is equal to my satellite data provider. I am querying my STK objects, and specifically the IAG data provider group. You don't have to manually write out this other stuff. If you just wanted to go ahead and copy everything, you can. That's completely fine. I'm going to write it out so at least you guys see a little bit more about the way things are formatted. So casting it to or pulling the data from a specific group. And that subgroup is the fixed folder. And I'm adding semicolons at the end, which you can or can leave. It's completely up to you. All right. And the way so before I pulled my data by specifying a period of time, this way is going to be a little bit different. So I'll be setting different time variables. So satellite DP3, setting the interface. IAG. Data period. All right. All right. And now the elements I'm going to pull out are going to be the time, latitude, longitude, and altitude. And of course, if you want to pull something out other than the altitude, you can use one of these other options here. But I'm going to set this to create a new variable, which will have my time. I want it to have my latitude. I want my longitude. As well as the altitude. So, pulling out this, now if I just take a look at the next line, it's pulling the information between my axis start and stop times. This section here is between, is going to be the step sizes of my data. And then of course I'm choosing it from this variable I just created. And then the next couple lines are going to be to pull out the altitude values specifically and then just print out that information. So I'll go through the next couple steps. Or I can just copy all of this to run the next line. So it's pulling out my satellite's altitude. So from my satellite, based off of the time varying information, I want my data sets, and I'll refer to it by name. So right now I'll pull out the altitude information and just get those values. And now I can use this to print out my satellite altitude data. And this data I can always compare it to a report that I might generate in STK. Keep in mind this data is between, this time step is like every 60 seconds, between my axis start and stop times. And like I said before, this script itself is already pre-written. So if you wanted to go ahead up at the top and run this analysis from the beginning, what you could have done is hit that big green button. Now that we have run this once on our computer, we can move these two lines to the top where we import everything else, because they're already established and they've already created those subfolders for the STK utilities and the STK objects. So on your machine now, you can go ahead and, if this is saved on your desktop, you can always move these two lines up at the top, and that will just streamline and quicken any type of analysis you're going to do next on your machine. There are great benefits of using STK integration, so being able to automate any type of analysis. So in this case, like I have the ability to click a button, generate a scenario, bring in my objects for analysis, and even pull out my data. And then I can go further in Python and do more analysis that way. So you can extend the capabilities that are already in STK with any other tools. In this case, I can go further with how I analyze my data. And then finally, if in this case, what we did is we pulled data out of STK, and then of course we can do anything else with those results. But you can also bring your data from other tools into STK and then go through and visualize them and use them in your analysis. So you can go back and forth with the way you pull your data in and out. And really, I would say the important thing is to make sure that you have your setup correct in the very beginning, and that when you are referencing the data, so the stuff that we did at the end, you know how you have cast the data and how you're going to pull it out. And I would recommend just taking a look at some of the data providers so you get an idea of which data you need and which ones you want to utilize in the next couple steps. All right, I hope you've enjoyed this training, and I will pass this back off to Craig. Another thing I wanted to mention before we close out is that using STK integration, so using STK with your Python, your MATLAB, or anything else, you have the ability to load in large data sets and compute your analysis very quickly. And then you have the ability to run through multiple scenario setups, conduct trade studies, and just do all of this in a very speedy manner. And you'll know that since you're using STK, you'll have the best data and results out of that.